In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, beneath layers of earth accumulated over millennia, lies a secret that fundamentally altered our understanding of human civilization itself. Around 9,600 years before the present day, during the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period, people gathered in this place to build something extraordinary. They erected massive T-shaped pillars of stone, some reaching 18 feet in height, carved with the likenesses of foxes, boars, and scorpions with a precision that speaks to careful intention and deep spiritual purpose. For thousands of years, this place lay hidden. In 1963, archaeologists surveyed the region without recognizing what lay beneath the surface. Then, in 1994, a shepherd's discovery sparked a revelation. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist, recognized what others had missed. These weren't random stones, but monuments. Systematic excavations beginning in 1995 would unveil a truth that challenged everything scholars believed about human progress. This wasn't a settlement. There were no houses, no permanent dwellings, no signs of agriculture or animal domestication. Yet here stood a temple complex of staggering ambition, built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked the social organization for such endeavors. The conventional narrative insisted that civilization required farming first, that monumental architecture came only after societies settled and accumulated surplus resources. Göbekli Tepe proved that story incomplete. Here was evidence that spiritual aspiration, communal purpose, and architectural vision preceded agriculture by thousands of years. The temple didn't just exist. It was eventually buried deliberately, its secrets preserved for a distant future to discover. In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, where the landscape rises and falls in gentle undulations across the Harran Plain, there exists a place that fundamentally altered our understanding of when human civilization truly began. 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa, perched on a limestone plateau that overlooks the vast expanse stretching toward the south, the East Taurus Mountains rising to the north, and the Karakada volcanic massif anchoring the eastern horizon, lies Göbekli Tepe. The name itself, derived from Turkish, means pot-belly hill, a modest designation for a site that would eventually challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew about human development and the origins of complex society. To understand the significance of this place, one must first journey backward through time to the beginning of the 9th millennium before the Common Era. The world was emerging from the grip of the last ice age, and the climate was shifting in profound ways. Around 9,600 years before the present day, during what archaeologists term the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period, the early Holocene was bringing warmth and moisture to the Near East. Temperatures were rising, precipitation was increasing, and the landscape was transforming from sparse steppe into a rich environment of steppe, forest. This climatic amelioration created ideal conditions for wild game and edible plants. Herds of gazelle roamed the plains, boars moved through the emerging woodlands, birds filled the skies. The land was generous, and the people who inhabited it were hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally to follow the abundance of nature's offerings. It is during this precise moment in human history, between 9,600 and 8,200 years before the present day, that something extraordinary occurred on this limestone plateau. A group of people, or perhaps many groups coming together for purposes we can only partially comprehend, undertook the construction of monumental architecture. They did not build villages, they did not establish permanent settlements, they did not plant crops or herd domesticated animals. Instead, they moved massive stones, carved them with intricate precision, and arranged them in elaborate circular and oval enclosures. They created structures that required organization, labor coordination, and shared purpose on a scale never before attempted by hunter-gatherer societies. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe was not a dramatic moment of sudden revelation. In 1963, researchers from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago conducted a survey of the region. Halit Sambel and Robert J. Braidwood, prominent archaeologists of their era, walked across the landscape documenting sites and artifacts. They noted Göbekli Tepe, but its significance went unrecognized. The limestone blocks scattered across the hilltop seemed interesting enough, but nothing suggested the profound mysteries buried beneath the earth. The site remained largely forgotten, passing through decades of relative obscurity, while other excavations captured the attention of the archaeological world. Then, in 1994, Klaus Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt was a researcher with the vision to see what others had overlooked. He recognized something in the arrangement of those stones, something in their shape and the way they were positioned across the landscape. He understood that these were not random fragments or natural formations, but deliberately placed megalithic pillars. More significantly, he grasped that this site represented something unprecedented. In 1995, he initiated systematic excavations that would continue for decades, gradually revealing a story that would transform our understanding of human history. What emerged from the soil was extraordinary. The excavations uncovered massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching heights of 5.5 meters, some weighing more than 10 tons. These pillars had been quarried locally from the limestone plateau, extracted from the bedrock with stone tools, and transported to the site through communal effort. The logistics alone suggest a level of social coordination that contradicted everything scholars believed about pre-pottery Neolithic societies. These were supposed to be small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers, lacking the social hierarchy necessary for large-scale projects. Yet here was evidence of precisely such organization. The pillars themselves bore the marks of extraordinary artistic achievement. Carved into their surfaces were elaborate animal reliefs, snakes coiled in sinuous patterns, foxes frozen in stone, wild boars rendered with anatomical precision, birds with wings spread as if about to take flight. Some pillars featured anthropomorphic elements, suggesting human or possibly divine forms. The artistry demonstrated not merely technical skill, but a sophisticated understanding of composition, proportion, and symbolic representation. These were not crude attempts at representation, but refined works created by people who possessed aesthetic sensibilities and artistic vision. The site itself was organized in a pattern that suggested ritual or ceremonial purpose. Multiple circular and oval enclosures were arranged across the hilltop, each containing its own arrangement of T-shaped pillars. Within these enclosures, archaeologists discovered stone tools, primarily flint blades and scrapers, characteristic of hunter-gatherer technology. They found animal bones, predominantly from wild species, gazelle, boar, and birds. Notably, they found no evidence of domesticated plants or animals, no seeds from cultivated crops, no bones from sheep or goats or cattle, no permanent structures that might suggest year-round habitation. The absence of these markers of agricultural society was striking. This was not a Neolithic village in the sense that term had always been understood. It was something else entirely. The dating of Göbekli Tepe emerged through rigorous scientific methodology. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from the earliest layers, charcoal, bone, other biological remains, provided consistent dates. The earliest evidence of human activity at the site extended back to approximately 11,000 years before the present day, though some scholars debate the precise chronology of the earliest phases. The main monumental construction phase, when the great pillars were erected and the enclosures were built, occurred between 9,600 and 8,200 years before the Common Era. This was the peak period, the time of maximum activity and investment in the site. Yet perhaps most intriguing of all was what happened when this era came to an end. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the site was deliberately buried. This was not abandonment through neglect. This was not destruction by invading forces or catastrophic natural disaster. The evidence suggested intentional, systematic burial. The enclosures were filled with earth and stone. The pillars were covered. The site was hidden, as if someone had made a conscious decision to conceal it from future generations. The motivations for this act remain one of the great mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. Did the people who built it decide its purpose had been fulfilled? Did religious or cultural beliefs demand that the sacred site be sealed away? Did changing social circumstances make the gathering place obsolete? The answers remain locked in the distant past. The location of Göbekli Tepe was not random. The limestone plateau where it stands offers excellent visibility across the surrounding landscape. The Heron Plain stretches toward the south, offering sweeping views of the terrain. The East Taurus Mountains define the northern horizon. The Karakada volcanic massif anchors the eastern approach. This prominence, this ability to see and be seen across great distances, may have held symbolic or practical significance. Perhaps the site served as a gathering place precisely because of its visibility. Perhaps the location itself carried meaning for the people who built it. Perhaps the choice to construct these monuments on a high place reflected beliefs about connection between earth and sky, between the people and the divine forces they sought to understand. The theories about why Göbekli Tepe was built have proliferated among scholars, each offering insights into how we might understand pre-pottery Neolithic society. Some researchers propose that the site functioned as a temple, a place dedicated to religious ritual and the veneration of divine forces. The elaborate carvings, the careful arrangement of pillars, the absence of domestic evidence, all support a religious interpretation. Others suggest that Göbekli Tepe was fundamentally a communal meeting place, a location where dispersed bands of hunter-gatherers gathered for seasonal ceremonies, for the exchange of goods and information, for the reinforcement of social bonds. Still others propose that the site served multiple functions simultaneously, that religion and social gathering were inextricably intertwined in pre-pottery Neolithic worldview. Some scholars have proposed that Göbekli Tepe may have been associated with communal feasting. The scale of the site would have required the gathering of many people, perhaps hundreds or even more. The provision of food for such gatherings would have required significant planning and resource mobilization. If this interpretation holds validity, then Göbekli Tepe might represent an early example of the feast as a mechanism for social bonding and the assertion of status or authority. The hunter-gatherers who gathered there would have consumed meat from wild game, supplemented by gathered plant foods available in the rich environment of the early Holocene. The shared meal would have created community, reinforced hierarchy, and perhaps generated the collective will necessary to undertake monumental construction. Another theory gaining attention among researchers concerns the possible astronomical significance of Göbekli Tepe. Some scholars have proposed that the orientation of certain pillars may align with celestial events, the rising or setting sun on the solstices, or the appearance of significant stars. The prominent location with clear sight lines to the horizon would have provided ideal conditions for astronomical observation. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe might represent early evidence of humanity's attempt to understand the cosmos, to mark the passage of seasons, and to align human ritual with the movements of celestial bodies. However, this remains speculative. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and not all scholars accept these astronomical interpretations as definitively proven. The question of why hunter-gatherers undertook such monumental construction has led some researchers to propose a provocative hypothesis. Perhaps the need to feed the large gatherings at Göbekli Tepe provided impetus for the domestication of plants and animals. Rather than agriculture driving the development of permanent settlements and monumental architecture, as traditional historical narratives suggested, perhaps the reverse was true. Perhaps the construction of ceremonial centers like Göbekli Tepe created demand that eventually led societies to experiment with cultivation and animal husbandry. This remains a hypothesis without direct archaeological proof, but it represents a fundamental reimagining of how agriculture emerged and what role ritual and social gathering played in that transformation. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required technical knowledge and organizational capacity that demanded explanation. The quarrying of massive limestone blocks using stone tools alone would have required skilled workers and careful planning. The transportation of multi-ton pillars across the landscape implied cooperative labor and possibly a system of coordination or authority to direct that labor. The carving of intricate reliefs suggested specialized artisans with years of training and expertise. The arrangement of multiple enclosures across the hilltop implied long-term planning and repeated gatherings over generations. All of this suggested that pre-pottery Neolithic society possessed greater complexity, greater social differentiation, and greater organizational capacity than traditional models had suggested. Yet the absence of evidence for permanent settlement, domesticated resources, or material inequality suggested that this complexity did not manifest in the ways that later civilizations would experience it. The people of Göbekli Tepe did not live in palaces or accumulate vast stores of grain. They did not appear to create written records or establish hereditary dynasties. The social hierarchies implied by the construction of monumental architecture seemed to be situational rather than institutionalized. Leadership may have been temporary, earned through wisdom or spiritual authority, rather than inherited through bloodlines. The organization of labor may have been communal, based on shared purpose rather than coercive authority. The society that built Göbekli Tepe was complex, but complex in ways quite different from the ancient civilizations that would later dominate the Mediterranean and Near East. The site itself, buried around 8,000 years before the Common Era, would remain hidden beneath layers of accumulated earth for the next 10,000 years. Soil and stone gradually covered the pillars. Vegetation grew over the mound. The knowledge of what lay beneath was lost. The people who built Göbekli Tepe left no written records to explain their purposes or beliefs. They left no descendants who maintained oral traditions about the meaning of the site. The site became invisible, a secret locked in the earth, waiting for the moment when modern archaeology would develop the tools and perspectives necessary to recognize its significance. When Klaus Schmidt and subsequent researchers began to excavate and analyze Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s and beyond, they were not simply uncovering ancient stones. They were encountering a fundamental challenge to the way history had been understood and organized. The traditional narrative of human progress had suggested a clear progression from simple hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural villages to complex civilizations with cities, writing, and state organization. Göbekli Tepe disrupted that narrative. It demonstrated that monumental architecture, artistic sophistication, and social coordination could emerge in societies that had not yet adopted agriculture. It suggested that the human capacity for ritual, for artistic expression, and for large-scale social organization existed long before the development of farming or permanent settlement. The implications of this realization rippled through the scholarly world. Göbekli Tepe became recognized as the oldest known monumental architecture, built by hunter-gatherers in the early Neolithic period. It challenged assumptions about the prerequisites for complex society. It suggested that religion, ritual, and the human desire to create meaning and beauty through monumental forms might have been fundamental drivers of social development, equal to, or perhaps even preceding, the practical necessities of food production and settlement. It raised profound questions about the origins of religion, the nature of early human spirituality, and the role of sacred places in the emergence of complex society. This is where the story of Göbekli Tepe begins, not with drama or sudden revelation, but with the quiet emergence from the earth of stones carved by hands that lived 11,000 years ago, stones that would force humanity to reconsider its own history and the deep origins of civilization itself. The year 1994 arrived without fanfare in the hills of southeastern Turkey. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist whose career had been marked by methodical precision rather than dramatic discovery, stood on a limestone plateau 15 kilometers northeast of Şanlıurfa. He was examining the results of a survey conducted 3 decades earlier, in 1963, when Istanbul University and the University of Chicago had first documented the site. That earlier team, led by Halit Sambel and Robert J. Braidwood, had noted unusual stone features on the hilltop, but had not grasped their true significance. The world was not ready, perhaps, to comprehend what lay beneath the accumulated soil of millennia. Schmidt's gaze fell upon massive T-shaped limestone pillars emerging from the earth. These were not the weathered remnants of classical temples or the fractured columns of forgotten empires. These pillars were something far older, far more fundamental to the human story. As he examined them more closely, radiocarbon dating of organic material from the earliest layers would eventually reveal dates reaching back to approximately 9,600 years before the present day. The main monumental phase of construction spanned from 9,600 to 8,200 years before the present era, placing these structures firmly at the threshold of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period, a time when humanity was still predominantly hunter-gatherer, still living without the agricultural revolution that scholars had long assumed was necessary to build monumental architecture. The hilltop itself occupied a prominent position within its landscape. From this vantage point, one could observe the Heron Plain stretching southward in gentle undulations, the East Taurus Mountains rising to the north, and the distinctive volcanic mass of Karakada visible to the east. The elevation and panoramic views would later prove significant to understanding why this particular location had been chosen for such elaborate construction. The early Holocene climate during this period was one of climatic amelioration following the last ice age. Temperatures were rising, precipitation was increasing, and the region supported a rich steppe forest environment teeming with wild game and edible plants. The landscape itself was a garden of natural abundance, though one requiring knowledge and effort to harvest. What Schmidt recognized with growing certainty was that these pillars represented something unprecedented. Some rose to heights of 5.5 meters, their limestone surfaces carved with meticulous precision. The weight of individual pillars exceeded 10 tons, requiring quarrying techniques and transportation methods that demanded significant communal effort. Yet the most remarkable feature lay in the ornamentation. The pillars were adorned with elaborate relief carvings depicting animals with striking naturalism and symbolic weight. Snakes coiled in dynamic poses. Foxes emerged from the stone with alert expressions. Boars charged with muscular intensity. Birds spread wings as if captured mid-flight. These were not crude representations, but rather sophisticated artistic expressions reflecting detailed observation of the natural world, combined with evident symbolic intent. The excavations initiated by Schmidt in 1995 would eventually reveal multiple monumental circular and oval enclosures, each containing these T-shaped pillars arranged with apparent purpose and organization. The pillars themselves became the focus of intense scholarly scrutiny. Some bore not only animal reliefs, but also anthropomorphic features, suggesting a complex symbolic language encoding meanings now lost to time. The T-shape itself held particular significance, with the wider cap at the top possibly serving as a stylized head or representing some cosmological concept. The precision of their carving and the consistency of their placement across multiple enclosures indicated not casual artistic expression, but rather a highly organized construction program guided by shared understanding and communal vision. The scale of these monumental undertakings demanded explanation. The traditional narrative of human development had positioned the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, as the pivotal moment enabling complex social organization and monumental architecture. Yet here stood evidence of monumental construction by hunter-gatherers, by people who left no trace of domesticated plants or animals in the archaeological record. The stone tools recovered from the site, flint blades, scrapers, and other implements, along with the animal bones found in association with the structures, told a consistent story. These were people who hunted wild boar, fox, and other fauna, who gathered wild plant foods, who possessed no herds or cultivated fields. Yet they had mobilized sufficient labor and coordination to quarry, transport, and precisely arrange massive stone pillars over multiple generations. The absence of permanent housing at the site further complicated traditional interpretations. Göbekli Tepe appeared to be something other than a settlement, other than a village where people established their daily lives. The structures themselves, the circular and oval enclosures, seemed designed for gathering, for assembly, for purposes that transcended the mundane requirements of shelter and storage. The ceremonial or ritual interpretation began to crystallize in scholarly minds. This was a place people traveled to, not a place where they lived. The effort invested in reaching this hilltop location, in participating in whatever activities occurred within these enclosures, must have held profound significance for the communities that made such journeys. What motivated hunter-gatherers to undertake such monumental construction? This question became the central puzzle of Göbekli Tepe's interpretation. Several competing theories emerged from the scholarly community, none commanding complete consensus, but each offering plausible explanations grounded in archaeological and anthropological understanding. Some researchers proposed that communal feasting events brought together multiple bands and tribes, creating opportunities for social bonding, alliance formation, and the sharing of resources. The labor required to construct such monuments could have been invested during seasons of abundance when hunting and gathering yielded sufficient surplus to support workers engaged in non-subsistence activities. The site itself could have been the destination for these gatherings, a neutral location where different groups could meet under the auspices of shared ritual or religious purpose. Others suggested that ancestor worship or veneration of the dead motivated the construction and use of Göbekli Tepe. The T-shaped pillars with their anthropomorphic features, might represent ancestral figures or spiritual beings. The burial of the site itself, which occurred around 8,000 years before the present day, could reflect a deliberate closing of a sacred space, a conscious decision to seal away what had been sacred and significant. This was not abandonment born of disaster or decline, but rather a purposeful act, a transformation of the site's function and meaning. Some scholars examined the astronomical alignments of the pillars and enclosures, proposing that the site functioned as an observatory or calendar. The orientations of certain structures might correspond to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, or the rising and setting of significant stars. If accurate, such alignments would suggest that Göbekli Tepe's builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics and incorporated this knowledge into their monumental architecture. However, this interpretation remained contested, lacking the definitive evidence that would quiet skeptical voices in the academic community. What became increasingly clear was that Göbekli Tepe represented the emergence of organized ritual behavior and religious expression at a scale previously unimagined for pre-agricultural societies. The construction of these monuments required not only labor, but also shared belief systems, communal decision-making, and social hierarchies sufficient to mobilize and direct that labor. Whether the society that built Göbekli Tepe was fundamentally egalitarian with temporary leadership structures, or whether it demonstrated emerging social hierarchy remained a matter of scholarly debate. The very act of monumental construction implied some form of social coordination beyond the capacity of small family groups, yet the exact nature of this organization remained elusive, preserved only in the silent stones themselves. The animal carvings took on new significance within this interpretive framework. The presence of dangerous predators and wild game suggested that these creatures held symbolic or spiritual importance in the worldview of Göbekli Tepe's builders. Snakes appear frequently in human religious traditions across cultures and millennia, often representing fertility, danger, wisdom, or cosmic principles. Boars, as dangerous and powerful teostunchful animals, might have symbolized masculine force or served as totemic emblems for particular groups. Foxes, smaller but cunning, could have represented trickster figures or spirits. The birds, capable of flight, might have embodied spiritual transcendence or communication with celestial realms. Each carving represented a choice, a deliberate decision to commemorate this particular creature in stone, suggesting that understanding the symbolic system encoded in these images would unlock crucial insights into the religious and philosophical worldview of pre-pottery Neolithic people. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, around 8,000 years before the present day, presented another profound mystery. Somewhere between the peak period of construction and use around 9,600 years before the present and the final sealing around 8,000 years before the present, the decision was made to bury the site. Tons of soil and debris were deliberately brought to cover the enclosures and pillars. This was not the gradual accumulation of natural sediment, but rather conscious, purposeful action. The site was transformed from a place of active use and ritual importance to a sealed, hidden place. What prompted this transformation? Did the site's function change? Did the communities that had invested such effort in its construction decide that its sacred purpose had been fulfilled and required sealing? Did religious beliefs evolve in ways that made the old site taboo or spiritually dangerous? The archaeological record could not yet provide answers to these questions, only evidence of the burial itself. The implications of Göbekli Tepe's existence began to reshape scholarly understanding of human development. The traditional narrative of the Neolithic Revolution, in which agriculture enabled the rise of civilization, complex society, monumental architecture, and religious institutions, required significant revision. Here stood monuments to ritual and belief, built by hunter-gatherers, predating agriculture by centuries or even millennia. Some researchers began to speculate whether the need to feed large gatherings at ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe might have provided the motivation for experimenting with plant and animal domestication. If such ceremonies regularly brought together hundreds or thousands of people, the challenge of providing sufficient food might have encouraged the transition toward agricultural production. This hypothesis, while intriguing, remained speculative without direct archaeological evidence linking Göbekli Tepe to the origins of farming. What emerged with increasing clarity was that Göbekli Tepe represented a revolutionary insight into the spiritual and intellectual life of pre-pottery Neolithic people. These were not simple hunter-gatherers lacking in sophistication or abstract thought. These were people capable of envisioning monumental structures, of organizing complex labor, of expressing religious and artistic vision through carved stone. They possessed sufficient surplus resources and sufficient social coordination to invest tremendous effort in non-subsistence activities. They had developed symbolic systems, ritual practices, and possibly astronomical knowledge. The limestone pillars, with their intricate carvings and precise arrangement, stood as testimony to the creativity, ambition, and spiritual depth of ancient humanity. The gradual accumulation of evidence from ongoing excavations reinforced these interpretations. Each new season of work revealed additional enclosures, additional carvings, additional stone tools, and animal bones. The picture became increasingly detailed, though fundamental questions about meaning and motivation remained. The site's location on its prominent hilltop, with commanding views across the surrounding landscape, suggested that visibility and prominence mattered to its builders. Perhaps the monuments themselves served as territorial markers, visible from great distances and proclaiming the presence and power of the communities that constructed them. Perhaps the hilltop location held spiritual significance, placing the ritual center at a liminal space between earth and sky, between the visible world and the realm of spirit. By the 1990s and early 2000s, as Klaus Schmidt's excavations continued and radiocarbon dating refined the chronology, Göbekli Tepe had transformed from a barely noticed archaeological site into an object of intense scholarly attention and popular fascination. The site challenged fundamental assumptions about human development, about the relationship between agriculture and civilization, about the spiritual capacities of pre-pottery Neolithic people. The T-shaped pillars, rising from the earth like silent sentinels, embodied a moment when human culture achieved something previously thought impossible without the organizational structures that agriculture supposedly enabled. The elaborate animal carvings testified to artistic sophistication and symbolic thought. The very scale and ambition of the monumental undertaking revealed the presence of organized religion and ritual behavior at the dawn of recorded human achievement. Göbekli Tepe had risen in the imagination of scholars and the public consciousness as a site of revolutionary significance. It represented a rewriting of human history, a recognition that the spiritual, artistic, and monumental achievements of humanity extended far deeper into the past than previously imagined. The hunter-gatherers who built these monuments possessed the capacity for abstract thought, for long-term planning, for collective action toward shared vision. They understood the power of ritual, the significance of animal symbolism, the importance of monumental expression. In the limestone pillars and carved reliefs of Göbekli Tepe lay evidence of a revolution in human consciousness that predated the agricultural revolution by centuries. The limestone plateau in southeastern Turkey holds its secrets close, but when Klaus Schmidt stood upon it in 1995, the earth began to surrender them. The excavations that commenced that year would transform not merely our understanding of a single archaeological site, but our fundamental comprehension of how human civilization emerged from the hunter-gatherer existence that had defined our species for hundreds of thousands of years. What emerged from beneath the soil was nothing short of revolutionary, a testament to human ambition, spiritual longing, and organizational capacity that predated everything scholars had believed possible in the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period. The site itself occupies a distinctive geographical position. Situated 15 kilometers northeast of Şanlıurfa, Göbekli Tepe rises as a prominent hill on a limestone plateau that overlooks the Harran Plain to the south, with the East Taurus Mountains rising to the north and the Karakada volcanic massif visible to the east. This elevated position, commanding views across vast stretches of landscape, was not accidental. The builders who selected this location understood the power of prominence, of visibility, of a place that could be seen from considerable distances across the steppe forest environment that characterized the early Holocene climate. The period from 9,600 to 8,200 before the Common Era represented a time of climatic amelioration following the last ice age, when temperatures rose and precipitation increased, creating conditions that supported rich populations of wild game and edible plants. The landscape that surrounded Göbekli Tepe during its peak occupation was far more verdant and alive than the semi-arid terrain visible today. When excavation began in earnest, the archaeologists confronted something that initially challenged their fundamental assumptions about what was possible in this epoch. The first revelation emerged as the earth was carefully removed, layer by layer, revealing a series of monumental circular and oval enclosures. These were not the scattered remains of temporary shelters or hunting camps. These were architectural statements of purpose and permanence. Within these enclosures stood the T-shaped pillars that would become the defining feature of Göbekli Tepe and the most striking evidence of pre-pottery Neolithic monumental achievement. The pillars themselves were extraordinary. Fashioned from limestone blocks quarried locally, they rose to heights of up to 5.5 meters, their weight reaching 10 tons or more. To comprehend what this meant requires understanding the technological and organizational capabilities required to accomplish such work. Each pillar had to be extracted from the bedrock using stone tools, a labor-intensive process requiring sustained effort and planning. They then had to be transported to the site, an undertaking that demanded coordination among numerous individuals working in concert toward a shared goal. The logistics alone, organizing groups of workers, sustaining them with food and water, maintaining focus across weeks or months of labor, speak to a level of social organization that contradicted the prevailing scholarly assumption that pre-pottery Neolithic peoples were simple, egalitarian bands incapable of such coordination. But the pillars themselves were only the beginning. What rendered them truly extraordinary was their ornamentation. The limestone surfaces bore elaborate carvings of animals rendered with surprising sophistication and anatomical accuracy. Snakes writhed across the stone surfaces. Foxes appeared in dynamic poses. Wild boars were depicted with characteristic tusks and powerful bodies. Birds took flight in carved relief. Scorpions appeared alongside other creatures of the Mesopotamian landscape. Some pillars bore anthropomorphic features, abstract representations of human forms, sometimes merely suggested through subtle curves and protrusions. These carvings were not crude or primitive. They demonstrated an artistic sensibility, an understanding of proportion and composition, and a symbolic vocabulary that spoke to a rich inner world of meaning. The discovery of these pillars created an immediate scholarly crisis. The prevailing narrative of human development held that monumental architecture was the exclusive province of agricultural societies. The reasoning seemed logical. Only settled communities with domesticated crops and animals could generate sufficient surplus to support the large labor forces required for such construction. Permanent settlements, the scholarly consensus maintained, required agriculture. Agriculture required settled communities. Therefore, monumental architecture could only emerge in agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe shattered this logical progression. Here was monumental architecture, constructed by peoples who showed no evidence whatsoever of agriculture or animal domestication. The archaeological evidence proved this definitively. The stone tools recovered from Göbekli Tepe were consistent with hunter-gatherer technologies, flint blades and scrapers designed for processing wild game and plant materials. The animal bones discovered at the site were overwhelmingly those of wild species, gazelles, boars, sheep, and other creatures hunted for sustenance. There was no evidence of domesticated plants, no evidence of domesticated animals, no grinding stones suggestive of cereal processing, no seeds of cultivated grains. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, pure and simple, yet they had mobilized their society to create monuments of stunning scale and sophistication. This realization forced scholars to confront fundamental questions about human motivation and capability. Why would hunter-gatherers, whose lives were typically characterized by mobility and small-scale social organization, suddenly undertake massive construction projects? What drove them to extract stone pillars weighing tons and transport them across the landscape? What purpose did these monuments serve? Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led the excavations and who would become the primary interpreter of Göbekli Tepe's significance, proposed that the site functioned as a temple, a place dedicated to ritual and religious practice. This interpretation was grounded in the physical evidence. The absence of domestic structures, storage facilities, or other indicators of permanent settlement suggested that Göbekli Tepe was not a village or town. Rather, it appeared to be a specialized ceremonial center, a destination to which people journeyed for specific purposes. The elaborate animal carvings and anthropomorphic features suggested a symbolic and spiritual dimension. The monumental scale of the enclosures and pillars conveyed a sense of the sacred, of a place set apart from the ordinary world. But other scholars offered alternative interpretations. Some suggested that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a communal meeting place where scattered hunter-gatherer groups gathered periodically for social interaction, exchange of goods, and the reinforcement of social bonds. The monuments, from this perspective, served as markers of identity and territorial significance. Still others proposed that the site may have served multiple functions simultaneously, a place for ritual observance, social gathering, and the reinforcement of collective identity. The scholarly debate reflected the genuine complexity of the archaeological evidence, which could support multiple interpretations depending upon one's theoretical framework. One particularly intriguing theory, proposed by some researchers, suggests a connection between Göbekli Tepe and the origins of agriculture itself. The argument proceeds from an observation about the scale of the site. Feeding large numbers of people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe for ceremonial purposes would have required substantial food resources. Some scholars hypothesize that the need to produce reliable food. Surpluses to support these gatherings may have provided the impetus for experimentation with plant and animal domestication. If this theory proves correct, it would suggest an unexpected causal relationship, that religion and ritual, rather than environmental pressure or economic incentive, may have driven the Neolithic revolution. However, this remains a hypothesis without direct archaeological evidence. The available evidence demonstrates that Göbekli Tepe predates clear evidence of agriculture in the region, but the precise causal relationships remain speculative. The question of astronomical significance has also captured scholarly attention. Some researchers have proposed that the orientation and arrangement of the pillars and enclosures may reflect alignments with celestial phenomena, the solstices, equinoxes, or the rising and setting positions of particular stars. Such astronomical knowledge would suggest a sophisticated understanding of the night sky and the mathematical relationships underlying celestial mechanics. However, these claims remain contested. The evidence for intentional astronomical alignments is not conclusive, and scholars debate whether such alignments, if they exist, represent deliberate design or coincidental arrangement. Nevertheless, the possibility that pre-pottery Neolithic peoples possessed such knowledge expands our understanding of cognitive capability in this epoch. The carvings themselves merit deeper consideration. The animal imagery was not random or decorative. The creatures depicted, snakes, boars, foxes, birds, scorpions, were creatures that inhabited the landscape surrounding Göbekli Tepe. They were part of the daily experience of the people who built the site, yet they were elevated to monumental form, rendered in stone, to endure through time. This suggests that these animals held symbolic significance. They may have represented spiritual forces or divine beings. They may have served as totems for particular groups. They may have embodied qualities, strength, cunning, swiftness, that held meaning within the belief system of the builders. The anthropomorphic features that appear on some pillars may represent deities, ancestral figures, or spiritual entities. Without written records or ethnographic parallels, we can only speculate about the precise meanings, but the presence of such imagery indicates a symbolic world of considerable richness and sophistication. The construction process itself deserves contemplation. Each pillar represents not merely a finished product, but a narrative of human effort and intention. Imagine the scene. Workers with stone tools laboriously extracting limestone blocks from the bedrock. The sound of stone striking stone, hour after hour, day after day. The organization required to sustain such labor, designating workers, coordinating their efforts, providing sustenance, maintaining morale. The transportation of these massive blocks across the landscape, likely using wooden sledges, and the combined muscle power of many individuals. The positioning of each pillar within its designated enclosure, the carving of intricate designs into the stone surface. The entire process required planning, coordination, and a shared vision of the end result. This was not the work of individuals or small family groups. This was communal labor on a scale that implies the existence of some form of social authority capable of organizing and directing such effort. The implications for understanding pre-pottery Neolithic social organization are profound. While scholars debate whether Göbekli Tepe provides evidence for emerging social hierarchies or whether it represents communal effort within an egalitarian framework, the site clearly demonstrates that pre-pottery Neolithic societies possessed greater organizational capacity than previously credited. The mobilization of labor, the coordination of effort across time, the transmission of knowledge about construction techniques, all of these required social structures and mechanisms of organization more complex than the minimal structures typically attributed to hunter-gatherer societies. Yet perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of Göbekli Tepe lies not in what the builders created, but in what they deliberately destroyed. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the site was intentionally buried. This was not abandonment or decay. This was deliberate action. The pillars and enclosures were covered with earth and stone, systematically and purposefully. Why would a society invest such tremendous effort in creating monuments only to deliberately bury them? This question has generated considerable scholarly speculation. Some suggest that the burial represented a ritual act, a symbolic conclusion to the site's use as a ceremonial center. Others propose that changing environmental conditions or social circumstances rendered the site obsolete, leading to its deliberate concealment. Still others suggest that the burial preserved the site for a spiritual purpose, perhaps to maintain its sanctity by removing it from the everyday world. Without additional evidence, we can only acknowledge that this deliberate burial remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of the site. The evidence recovered from Göbekli Tepe speaks to a human capacity for abstract thought, aesthetic expression, and communal organization that challenges simplistic narratives of human development. The pre-pottery Neolithic peoples who built these monuments possessed the cognitive and social tools necessary to conceive of ambitious projects and execute them successfully. They possessed spiritual beliefs complex enough to warrant monumental expression. They possessed the organizational capacity to coordinate large-scale labor. They possessed artistic sensibility and technical skill. They possessed, in short, the essential qualities that define human civilization, even though they had not yet adopted agriculture or established permanent settlements. The excavations that commenced in 1995 and continued through subsequent decades revealed not merely archaeological artifacts, but a fundamental truth about human nature. The drive to create, to commemorate, to express spiritual and aesthetic values through monumental form, this drive does not await the emergence of agricultural surplus. It emerges wherever human consciousness develops sufficiently to conceive of the sacred and to organize social effort toward its expression. Göbekli Tepe stands as testament to this truth, a monument built by hunter-gatherers who understood that some things were worth the extraordinary effort required to create permanence in stone. The limestone plateau beneath southeastern Turkey held its revelation slowly, layer by layer, as the 1990s progressed and Klaus Schmidt's systematic excavations deepened. What had emerged from the earth in those early seasons of exploration was not merely a collection of ancient stones, but a profound challenge to everything the archaeological establishment believed about human civilization. The T-shaped pillars stood as silent witnesses to an extraordinary moment in human history, and yet their very existence seemed to defy the conventional narrative that scholars had constructed across generations. By the late 1990s, the evidence from Göbekli Tepe had accumulated to such an extent that it could no longer be dismissed or minimized. The radiocarbon dating of organic material from the earliest layers indicated human activity extending back to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era, placing the site firmly within the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period. This dating alone was extraordinary, but it was the nature of what had been constructed during this epoch that truly unsettled the academic world. Here, in a landscape that predated agriculture by more than 1,000 years, hunter-gatherers had organized themselves to create monumental architecture of astonishing sophistication and scale. The pillars themselves demanded explanation. Some reached heights of 5.5 meters, their limestone forms quarried from bedrock and transported to the site through means that required careful coordination and communal effort. Individual pillars weighed as much as 10 tons, a mass that could not be moved by small family groups working in isolation. The very existence of these structures posed an immediate problem to traditional archaeological thinking. The standard narrative of human development had long posited that civilization emerged only after the adoption of agriculture, that permanent settlements and social organization were prerequisites for monumental construction. Yet here stood Göbekli Tepe, built by people who possessed no domesticated crops, no domesticated animals, and who apparently lived not in permanent villages, but in transient camps. The T-shaped form of the pillars represented a deliberate architectural choice, and this choice itself carried profound implications. The pillars were not crude standing stones, but carefully shaped monuments, their forms echoing an almost anthropomorphic quality. The horizontal crosspiece at the top suggested a pair of arms or a head, lending the pillars a quasi-human appearance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone viewing them. This was not accidental. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had possessed a sophisticated understanding of form and symbolism, and they had chosen to create monuments that embodied something deeply meaningful to their culture. What made this realization even more striking was the elaborate decoration adorning many of these pillars. Intricate animal reliefs covered their surfaces, rendered with remarkable skill and naturalistic detail. Snakes coiled along the stone, their scales carefully incised. Foxes and boars appeared in dynamic poses, their musculature and movement captured with an artist's eye. Birds spread their wings across the limestone faces. These were not crude representations, but sophisticated artistic expressions, created by individuals who possessed genuine artistic training and a deep familiarity with the animals they depicted. The very existence of this artistic tradition suggested a culture with leisure time, with individuals capable of specializing in artistic pursuits, with patrons wealthy or powerful enough to commission such elaborate works. Yet alongside these animal representations appeared something equally intriguing: anthropomorphic features. Some pillars bore marks that suggested human characteristics, abstract representations of the human form that hinted at the symbolic importance of humanity itself within the cosmology of Göbekli Tepe's builders. These representations were not realistic depictions, but stylized abstractions, suggesting that the people who created them were engaged in conceptual thinking, in the creation of symbolic systems that transcended simple naturalism. They were, in essence, creating a visual language through which to express their understanding of the world and their place within it. The excavations of the late 1990s revealed the architectural plan of the site with increasing clarity. Multiple circular and oval enclosures had been constructed, each apparently serving some ceremonial or ritual function. These structures showed evidence of careful planning and organization. The pillars were arranged in specific patterns, aligned in ways that suggested intentional design rather than random placement. Some scholars began to propose that these alignments might correspond to celestial events, that the builders of Göbekli Tepe might have been observing the heavens and encoding their astronomical knowledge into the very structure of their monuments. While such claims remained speculative and were not universally accepted within the archaeological community, they pointed toward a culture capable of sophisticated observation and abstract thought. The accumulation of evidence from the site presented a profound crisis for conventional archaeological theory. How could such monumental architecture have been constructed by hunter-gatherers? What could have motivated the enormous investment of labor required to create these structures? The answers to these questions demanded a fundamental reconsideration of human social organization and the origins of complex culture. One emerging theory proposed that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a ritual or ceremonial center, a place where scattered hunter-gatherer groups converged for significant gatherings. The scale of the monuments suggested that construction had proceeded over generations, with communities repeatedly returning to the site to maintain and expand the structures. Archaeological evidence supported this interpretation. The site contained no evidence of permanent habitation, no domestic structures, no storage facilities. Instead, the material culture recovered from Göbekli Tepe consisted almost entirely of stone tools and the remains of wild animals, particularly gazelle and boar. The bones recovered from the site showed signs of having been processed for meat consumption, suggesting that large feasts or communal meals may have accompanied the ceremonies and rituals conducted at the site. This interpretation raised a tantalizing possibility that resonated throughout the archaeological world. What if Göbekli Tepe represented the birthplace of organized religion itself? What if the rituals conducted at this site, the ceremonies that drew communities together and compelled them to invest enormous resources in monumental construction, represented humanity's first organized religious practices? Klaus Schmidt, who had devoted his career to understanding the site, argued forcefully for this interpretation. He proposed that Göbekli Tepe was nothing less than the world's first temple, a place where early religious specialists had conducted rituals designed to bind communities together and to mediate between the human world and the spiritual realm. The theory that Göbekli Tepe represented an early religious center gained credibility when scholars considered the broader context of human cultural development. Across numerous cultures and geographical regions, monumental architecture had consistently served religious purposes. Temples, shrines, and ceremonial centers had always been among humanity's earliest and most impressive architectural achievements. If Göbekli Tepe represented an exception to this pattern, it would be remarkable indeed. But if it represented an early manifestation of this universal human pattern, then the site took on even greater significance. It suggested that the human impulse toward religious expression and ceremonial practice was ancient beyond measure, that it preceded agriculture, permanent settlement, and the other hallmarks of civilized society by more than 1,000 years. Yet the crisis that Göbekli Tepe presented to the archaeological establishment deepened when scholars confronted another extraordinary aspect of the site: its deliberate burial. The evidence was unmistakable. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, at the peak of the site's use and significance, the structures had been carefully covered with earth and stone. This was not the result of natural processes or the gradual accumulation of sediment. The layers of fill that buried the site showed evidence of having been deliberately placed. The people of Göbekli Tepe, at some point in their history, had made the conscious decision to bury their most sacred and important structures beneath the earth. This act of deliberate burial remained one of the most enigmatic aspects of the site. Why would a culture invest generations of labor in constructing monumental structures only to deliberately conceal them? Several theories competed for scholarly attention. Some proposed that the burial represented a ritual act, a ceremonial closing of the site that held spiritual significance for the builders. Others suggested that the burial might have been motivated by practical concerns, perhaps related to changing climate conditions or shifts in settlement patterns. Still others proposed that the burial represented a symbolic act, a way of marking a transition or transformation in the society that built the site. Whatever the motivation, the act of burial itself demonstrated that the people of Göbekli Tepe possessed a sophisticated understanding of meaning-making and symbolic action. They did not simply abandon their sacred center, they deliberately and carefully concealed it, suggesting that this act itself held profound significance. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe became increasingly significant as scholars grappled with questions about the site's chronology and its relationship to broader patterns of human cultural development. The site's main phase of construction and use spanned from approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era to 8,200 years before the Common Era, a period of roughly 400 years. This timeline corresponded with the early Holocene, a period characterized by climatic amelioration following the last ice age. Temperatures were rising, precipitation was increasing, and the landscape of southeastern Turkey was transforming into a steppe forest environment rich with wild game and edible plants. This environmental abundance would have supported the gatherings of large numbers of people, the communal feasts that may have accompanied the rituals conducted at Göbekli Tepe. As the 1990s drew to a close and the early 2000s began, the archaeological community found itself at a crossroads. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe demanded a fundamental reassessment of how scholars understood human cultural development. The traditional narrative had positioned the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and permanent settlement, as the moment when human civilization truly began. Agriculture, the conventional wisdom suggested, had enabled the accumulation of surplus wealth, the emergence of social hierarchies, and the construction of monumental architecture. All of these developments were supposed to have followed from the adoption of farming. Yet Göbekli Tepe suggested a different narrative entirely. Here was monumental architecture, clear evidence of social organization capable of mobilizing large groups of people and sophisticated artistic and symbolic expression, all preceding agriculture by more than 1,000 years. The site challenged the deterministic view of history that had dominated archaeological thinking. It suggested instead that human cultural development was more complex and multifaceted than previous scholars had imagined, that the impulses toward ritual expression, communal gathering, and monumental construction might have preceded and perhaps even contributed to the adoption of agriculture rather than following from it. This realization constituted a genuine crisis for archaeological theory. It was not a crisis of evidence, for the evidence from Göbekli Tepe was increasingly difficult to dismiss. Rather, it was a crisis of interpretation, a moment when the established frameworks through which scholars understood the human past proved inadequate to account for the physical evidence emerging from the Turkish plateau. The site forced archaeologists to confront the possibility that their previous understanding of human history was incomplete, that crucial chapters had been written long before the conventional narrative suggested, and that the origins of civilization were far more mysterious and complex than earlier generations had imagined. The turning point represented by Göbekli Tepe was not merely an archaeological discovery, but a fundamental shift in how humanity understood itself. The site demonstrated that the capacity for large-scale social organization, for ritual expression, for artistic achievement, and for monumental architecture was not a product of agricultural civilization, but something far more ancient and fundamental to human nature. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive or undeveloped. They were sophisticated thinkers and skilled craftspeople, capable of organizing complex projects and expressing profound ideas through architecture and art. They lived in a world rich with meaning and symbolism, a world structured by ritual and ceremony, a world in which the sacred and the profane were woven together into a coherent whole. Yet this realization brought with it new questions and new uncertainties. If hunter-gatherers could build temples, organize large-scale gatherings, and create sophisticated artistic traditions, then what exactly was the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the agricultural revolution that would eventually transform human society? Did the construction of this temple somehow contribute to the domestication of plants and animals? Or was Göbekli Tepe a cultural dead end, a remarkable flourishing of pre-agricultural society that would eventually be superseded by the agricultural peoples who would eventually come to dominate the region? The evidence suggested that the site had been deliberately buried around 8,000 years before the Common Era, precisely at the moment when agriculture was beginning to emerge in the Near East. Was this timing coincidental, or did it reflect some deeper relationship between the abandonment of Göbekli Tepe and the rise of agricultural civilization? These questions would drive archaeological inquiry for decades to come. The turning point marked by Göbekli Tepe was not a moment of resolution, but a moment of opening. A moment when the archaeological establishment recognized that its previous understanding was incomplete and that fundamental reassessments would be necessary. The site had rewritten the narrative of human history, pushing back the origins of civilization and complexity to epochs far more remote than scholars had previously imagined. In doing so, it had also raised new questions about the very nature of civilization itself, about what it meant to be human, and about the deep historical roots of the religious and cultural expressions that had shaped human societies throughout history. The earth remembers what humans forget. Beneath the limestone plateau in southeastern Turkey, layers of soil accumulated over millennia, each stratum a page in a chronicle written not in words, but in stone, bone, and ash. By the early 21st century, more than 1,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, archaeologists had begun to comprehend the magnitude of what they held in their hands. The site did not simply fade away. It was consciously, purposefully covered. This act of intentional burial, completed around 8,000 BCE, remains one of the most profound mysteries in the archaeological record. A question that echoes across the centuries. Why would a society invest such tremendous effort to hide away the very monument that had defined their spiritual and communal existence? Klaus Schmidt understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe was not an act of destruction, but of reverence. The ancient builders did not abandon their great stone circles in decay or allow them to crumble into ruin. Instead, they covered the site with care, layer upon layer of sediment and stone, preserving it as one might preserve a sacred memory. This preservation through burial suggests a worldview foreign to modern sensibilities, one where the most precious things were sometimes hidden away. Not to be forgotten, but to be protected. The pillars, with their intricate animal carvings and symbolic weight, were entombed like the treasures of pharaohs, sealed away from the world they had served. The process of burial itself reveals much about the society that undertook it. The act required organization, labor coordination, and shared purpose. Groups of people had to agree that this monument, which had drawn them together, which had bound them through ritual and ceremony, should now be concealed. Some scholars have proposed that the burial represented a transition, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Around 8,000 BCE, the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period gave way to the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, a transformation that coincided with subtle but significant changes in how humans lived. Perhaps the burial of Göbekli Tepe was an intentional closing of a chapter, a conscious decision that the age of hunter-gatherer monumentalism was ending. What remains certain is that Göbekli Tepe was covered with deliberate care. The site did not suffer from a catastrophic collapse or natural disaster. Rather, it was systematically buried under accumulated soil and stone, preserving the monuments beneath layers of protection. This intentional interment has proven invaluable to modern archaeology. The careful burial created conditions that protected the site from erosion, looting, and the weathering that would have destroyed the delicate carvings on the T-shaped pillars. In hiding the site, the ancient builders unwittingly created a time capsule, a sealed chamber of archaeological information that would remain largely undisturbed for more than 10,000 years. The implications of Göbekli Tepe's existence extend far beyond the site itself, reshaping the entire framework through which scholars understand human cultural development. For generations, the narrative of human progress had followed a particular trajectory. First came the development of agriculture, which allowed for permanent settlements and surplus production. From agriculture emerged the complexity necessary for monumental architecture, organized religion, and sophisticated social hierarchies. This progression, known as the Neolithic Revolution, was presented as nearly inevitable, a logical march from hunter-gatherer simplicity to agricultural complexity. Göbekli Tepe shattered this linear narrative. Here stood monumental architecture, constructed by hunter-gatherers during the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, built before agriculture had transformed human societies. The T-shaped pillars, some rising to heights of 5.5 meters and weighing more than 10 tons, required quarrying, transportation, and installation. The intricate animal reliefs carved into the stone demanded artistic skill and cultural sophistication. The circular and oval enclosures demonstrated advanced understanding of geometry and spatial organization. Yet the people who built this monument had not domesticated plants or animals. They hunted wild boar, gazelle, and other game. They gathered nuts, seeds, and wild grains. They lived as their ancestors had for millennia, yet they created something that rivaled any monument of later civilizations in its scale and ambition. This contradiction forced a reconsideration of what drove human cultural achievement. The traditional model suggested that agriculture created the surplus necessary for specialization and monumental construction. But Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that complex ritual behavior, large-scale communal projects, and sophisticated symbolic expression could emerge in hunter-gatherer societies. Some scholars have proposed that the relationship between agriculture and monumentalism might be reversed. Perhaps the need to feed large gatherings at places like Göbekli Tepe, the desire to host ever larger ritual ceremonies, provided one of the motivations for developing agriculture. Perhaps the spiritual and social demands of maintaining such a center drove innovation in food production. This hypothesis remains debated, lacking direct archaeological evidence, but it represents a fundamental shift in how scholars think about causation and cultural development. The purpose of Göbekli Tepe continues to inspire scholarly discussion and occasional disagreement. Klaus Schmidt himself argued forcefully that the site was fundamentally religious, a temple dedicated to ritual practices now lost to time. The concentration of animal carvings, the apparent lack of domestic or residential structures, the positioning of the site on a prominent hilltop with commanding views of the surrounding landscape, all suggested to Schmidt that this was a ceremonial center, a place where people gathered to perform rituals whose exact nature could only be inferred from the archaeological record. Other scholars have proposed alternative interpretations. Some suggest that Göbekli Tepe may have served as a communal meeting place, a location where scattered hunter-gatherer bands gathered seasonally for ceremonies, feasting, and the exchange of goods and information. The animal carvings might represent totemic symbols, identifying different family groups or clans that participated in the gatherings. The pillars themselves, in some interpretations, could represent ancestors or spiritual beings, standing sentinel over the ceremonial space. The absence of permanent housing would make sense if the site was inhabited only seasonally, during specific ritual occasions when large numbers of people converged. The question of who built Göbekli Tepe and how they organized themselves to accomplish such a feat remains tantalizingly open. The site predates the emergence of obvious political hierarchies and kingship by thousands of years. No evidence suggests that a single powerful leader directed the construction. Instead, the monument appears to be the product of communal effort, organized through shared belief and ritual purpose rather than coercive authority. This raises fascinating questions about how complex societies can organize themselves without formal political structures. The construction of Göbekli Tepe suggests that shared religious conviction, communal identity, and the desire to create something transcendent can mobilize labor and coordinate effort as effectively as any king's command. The animal carvings adorning the pillars provide windows into the symbolic world of the people who created them. Snakes, foxes, boars, birds, and scorpions appear repeatedly, suggesting these creatures held spiritual or totemic significance. Some of the pillars feature what appear to be anthropomorphic characteristics, human-like features carved into stone, possibly representing deities, ancestors, or spiritual beings. The repetition of certain animal motifs across multiple pillars and enclosures suggests a coherent symbolic system, a shared language of religious meaning understood by all who gathered at the site. This iconographic consistency points to something profound, a shared culture, a common worldview, and possibly even the beginnings of organized religion. The environmental context of Göbekli Tepe's flourishing cannot be overlooked. The period from 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, when the site was actively used, coincided with the Holocene climatic optimum, a period of relative warmth and moisture following the Ice Age. The Harran Plain and surrounding regions supported rich steppe forest environments teeming with wild game. The abundance of resources during this period may have allowed hunter-gatherer populations to grow and concentrate in ways that would have been impossible in earlier, colder times. This ecological abundance, combined with the emergence of ritual practices and shared spiritual beliefs, created the conditions necessary for the construction of Göbekli Tepe. The decline of Göbekli Tepe's primary ceremonial function, marked by its deliberate burial around 8000 BCE, coincided with subtle but significant changes in the archaeological record. The Pre-Pottery Neolithic B period that followed saw the beginning of agricultural experimentation, the domestication of wild plants and animals, and the establishment of more permanent settlements. Whether the burial of Göbekli Tepe represented a conscious rejection of the old ritual ways in favor of new agricultural pursuits, or whether the site was covered as an act of reverence at the conclusion of a sacred era, remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear is that the monument belonged to a particular moment in human history, a moment when ritual and community gathering had reached an apex, and that moment was deliberately, carefully concluded. The rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe in 1994 by Klaus Schmidt transformed not merely the archaeology of the ancient Near East, but the fundamental understanding of human cultural development. The systematic excavations that began in 1995 and continue to the present day have revealed layer after layer of evidence, each discovery adding nuance and complexity to the portrait of pre-pottery Neolithic society. The T-shaped pillars stand as testament to human ambition, spiritual yearning, and the capacity for large-scale communal organization. The animal carvings speak to a rich symbolic world, a universe of meaning that made sense to the people who created them, even though that meaning is now lost. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe extends into contemporary discussions about the nature of civilization, religion, and human achievement. For decades, scholars debated whether complex culture could emerge without agriculture, whether monumental architecture required settled populations with agricultural surplus. Göbekli Tepe answered these questions definitively. Complex ritual behavior, sophisticated artistic expression, and large-scale communal projects emerged in hunter-gatherer societies, driven not by economic necessity, but by spiritual conviction and shared cultural values. This recognition opens new avenues for understanding how human societies develop and transform, suggesting that spiritual and social motivations can be as powerful as economic ones in driving cultural change. The site also challenges modern assumptions about progress and development. The conventional narrative presents history as a linear march from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized, from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrial. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that this narrative is incomplete. The people who built those monuments were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They possessed sophisticated understanding of stoneworking, geometry, and symbolic expression. They organized complex social structures and coordinated large-scale projects. They created art of remarkable sophistication and depth, yet they did not follow the path toward agriculture and urbanization that later became dominant. Instead, they created something unique, something that flourished for more than 1,000 years and then was deliberately, reverently concluded. The physical remains of Göbekli Tepe continue to yield information to modern archaeology. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the site, particularly charcoal and bone, provides precise chronological anchoring for the monuments and their evolution. Stratigraphic analysis of the layers reveals the sequence of construction and modification, showing how the site developed and changed over the centuries of its use. The absence of domesticated plant or animal remains confirms that the people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe remained hunter-gatherers, deriving their sustenance from wild game and foraged plants. The toolkit recovered from the site, including finely worked flint blades and scrapers, demonstrates technological sophistication and specialization. The landscape surrounding Göbekli Tepe holds meaning as well. The site sits on a limestone plateau, positioned to command views of the Harran Plain to the south, the East Taurus Mountains to the north, and the Karakada volcanic massif to the east. This prominent location may have held symbolic significance, marking the site as a center point between different geographical and possibly spiritual realms. The visibility of the monument from great distances would have made it a landmark recognizable to travelers and gathering groups across the region. The choice of location suggests that the builders understood the power of place, the way that landscape and geography can reinforce spiritual and ceremonial meaning. The question of whether Göbekli Tepe represents the origins of organized religion remains open and contested. Some scholars see in the site the earliest evidence for religious practice and belief, the moment when humans first organized their spiritual yearnings into communal ritual. Others argue that religion, in some form, must have existed for millennia before Göbekli Tepe, and that the site represents only the earliest monumental expression of beliefs that had long been developing. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions. The evidence suggests that Göbekli Tepe formalized and monumentalized spiritual practices that had roots deep in human prehistory, while simultaneously marking a transformation in how those practices were expressed and organized. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe remains perhaps the most poignant aspect of its legacy. The people who covered the site did not abandon it in decline or allow it to fall into ruin. They chose to hide it, to protect it, to seal it away beneath layers of earth. This act suggests a worldview in which the most sacred things were sometimes removed from sight, preserved in darkness and silence. In hiding Göbekli Tepe, the ancient builders created a paradox. They removed the monument from the world, yet in doing so, they ensured its preservation for those who would come 10,000 years later. The burial that seemed like an ending became, in the fullness of time, a kind of protection, a careful preservation that allowed future generations to encounter the monument in remarkably intact condition. Today, Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument not merely to the achievements of pre-pottery Neolithic society, but to the power of human aspiration and the enduring impact of cultural creation. The T-shaped pillars, still bearing the marks of ancient chisels and hands, still displaying the intricate carvings of animals that held meaning for people now dead for more than 11,000 years, speak across the gulf of time. They tell of a moment when human societies were organized around shared ritual and spiritual belief, when the building of monuments served purposes that were not economic or political, but sacred. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe is the recognition that human complexity, artistic expression, and spiritual yearning do not require agriculture or urbanization. They require only community, shared belief, and the will to create something that transcends the immediate and material. The site continues to reveal new information to archaeologists who work carefully within its layers, extracting evidence with precision and respect. Each season brings new discoveries, new insights into the lives of the people who built the monuments. Yet for all that has been learned, Göbekli Tepe retains its essential mystery. The exact nature of the rituals performed at the site, the specific beliefs that motivated its construction and burial, the precise social organization of the people who gathered there, these remain beyond the reach of archaeology. What remains is the profound achievement itself, the standing stones carved with animals, the circular enclosures that held ceremonies now forgotten, the evidence of human beings creating meaning and community in the ancient world. The story of Göbekli Tepe is ultimately a story about humanity itself, about the universal human impulse to create, to gather, to mark the sacred through monumental expression. It reminds us that civilization is not a single path, not a linear progression from simple to complex, but rather a diverse collection of ways that human societies have organized themselves around shared values and beliefs. The people who built Göbekli Tepe created something remarkable without agriculture, without writing, without the apparatus of state power. They did it through shared conviction, communal effort, and the belief that some things were worth building, even if those things would eventually be hidden away beneath the earth. In that act of creation and concealment lies a lesson that echoes across the millennia, speaking to something fundamental about human nature and our endless quest to create meaning in the world.